Voice of the Sea, learning from experts across the ocean.
Welcome to Voice of the Sea. In this episode of Voice of the Sea,
we're at the beach on Maui with coastal hazard specialist Tara Owens. Tara explains the importance of sand dunes in protecting beaches, how they supply sand to the beach and provide habitat for the wildlife that inhabits them. Tara also shows us how building seawalls can take away the sand dunes, causing major beach erosion.
Most of these homes along this particular stretch of beach where we're standing now are relatively new homes, and so they were probably subject to the existing regulatory requirements for shoreline setbacks, which are based on the location of the shoreline and then an erosion rate that the county has established for determining their setbacks. And those erosion rates are based on some research done by the University of Hawaii on how the shorelines around the island have changed over time. And they've studied how the shorelines have retreated and turned that into a rate of change that we can then use to apply in a regulatory sense. And then hopefully we're positioning new developments outside of the hazard zone. However, shorelines change, especially on the North Shore, pretty rapidly.
So this is a case of a beach eroding faster than people thought that it would, or it's just above average?
A lot of these shorelines on the North Shore are above average, and they may be eroding faster than we expected in some cases. So both of those things. There's another project just to the west of this area where there has been ongoing beach renourishment as well. And in that case, rather than using offshore sand, they've been getting sand from the sand quarry in the center of the island, up above Kahului. There's an area called Sand Hills and Maui Lani, and all of that is basically an ancient sand dune. When we were down in South Maui, we were talking about how the fine-grained sands are the ones that get blown by the wind and start to form dunes. Well, that's what formed the giant sand dune we have in the middle of Kahului in Wailuku area. And so it's an ancient sand dune, old sands that have been blown there for thousands of years. And that sand now is currently being mined to be used for cement. But it's also happens to be usable for beach renourishment. And so some other projects along the North Shore have been going on for a couple of decades now. And in places where there were 20 years ago no sands on the beach, there are actually nice big recreational beaches in place now because of those beach renourishment projects. So beach renourishment is considered a very good solution for mitigating erosion. On the other hand, as with any solution, when we're trying to hold back Mother Nature, there can be also consequences, environmental consequences. One of the downsides to the other renourishment project up the coast is that the inland sand is much finer grained than the natural beach sand, because we're on the North Shore with large waves, coarser grained sand. So it's not a direct match. And some of those fine grained sediments can get suspended in the water column and fill in the pukas and the coral reef, or maybe even remain suspended for a period of time, which can affect the water quality potentially. And so there are some groups on the island that are concerned about those possible negative impacts of beach renourishment.
And are they putting sand in places where you said 20 years ago there wasn't sand? Is that because we removed it, or is it because the sand didn't naturally occur there?
It's all of those things that we talked about that are happening on the North Shore, partially because North Shore sands have been mined. That has had a huge impact on the North Shore. Basically, you have a sediment budget. It's just like your bank account. You only have so much money, you only have so much sand. And when you take away that sand and it doesn't get replenished, then you've lost sediment from the budget. And when you permanently lose sediment out of that sediment budget, shorelines retreat. So that's had a huge impact on all of the beaches on the North Shore, especially. But just the general environment too, with the large waves and the wind always blowing. And now we have development that's impacted the beaches. That it's just exacerbated erosion.
Can you
along the
show
North
me
Shore.
some of the signs of erosion right here?
Sure. This existing wall that we're looking at right here probably wasn't intended to be a seawall, actually. Probably was more like a landscaping feature, a retaining wall. Certainly, the tennis court wasn't this close to the shoreline when it was put here. So you can definitely see evidence of beach erosion, and now part of this development is much closer to the shoreline than anybody would have probably desired for it to be.
Are those the trees down there? They've been exposed because the beach is washing away.
Exactly. There were once many more trees along this particular part of Shoreline. A lot of ironwood trees and other types of trees. And just like these down here, let's walk on down the beach. You can see around the corner here, there are large root balls from large trees that were once along the shoreline here.
Oh, is that like a fish pond area?
I don't think anybody knows. There are a lot of features along the North Shore that are undocumented. Sometimes they're groins, sometimes they appear to be groins, or sometimes they appear to be breakwaters. Breakwaters are another type of structure that you can build parallel to the shoreline and offshore that reduces wave energy before it reaches the shoreline in hopes of reducing beach erosion. We see some features like that along the North Shore. But another thing that's natural along the North Shore are pieces like that, benches of what's called beach rock. And those actually can be indicative of where the shoreline once was, where the beach would have extended that far offshore.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that could be what this feature is here.
Very cool.
So we know in the early 1900s that the shoreline was much further Mackay than it is today. And that's one line of evidence. And then as well as what you pointed out, these trees.
Wow.
Now, before the beach renourishment project was implemented here, this shoreline looked exactly like this.
Really?
So we've removed a lot of the dead trees in addition to adding the sand on the beach. One thing that we'd like to do on Maui, or at least I'm a big proponent of, is putting some money into some research so that we can find out if there are any more, or where are potential sources of sand offshore for use in beach renourishment. We really don't know. Nobody's really mapped, or at least to a small extent, we've mapped the sand deposits offshore. And if beach renourishment is something that we intend to do in the future, we're going to have to find sand.
And so how would you go about mapping where those sands are offshore?
There's a couple of different ways. UH has done some research, and they have implemented historical aerial photos where you can actually see through the water, and they've documented the pukas in the reef that have filled with sand. Then you can identify them and then go out and dive in the water and probe them and see how deep they are and make an estimate of what kind of volume of sand is there. The other way that really hasn't been done very much in Hawaii or on Maui compared to what they do in other places around the world and on the mainland is you can use sonar to look beneath the surface and try to find out how much sand is available.
Sure. So sonar being like the sound waves that you send through the water, and then as they hit the sand, I'm assuming would have a different penetration level than, say, adjacent rock or something
That's
else.
right. Exactly right.
Very cool.
Exactly right. So we're getting wet.
Yes.
That's another indication of the volatility of the shorelines here. Fortunately, most of them were subject to some type of setback regulation, but there are places on the island where large buildings, condominiums, or even smaller homes were built prior to any regulations being in place. And in those cases, we literally have buildings falling in the water. And those are the really difficult cases, because in those cases, there's no time for beach renourishment. And typically, unless retreat was a real option, unless actually picking up homes and buildings and moving them away from the shoreline was an option, then it leaves us really in emergency situations where the only option is hardening the shoreline. And that can be undesirable for a couple of reasons. So maybe we'll walk down to the other end of this beach and look at a seawall and show you what it can do to the beach and the shoreline.
So we talked earlier about the tsunami and how it came through these houses.
Yeah, so I actually believe that the tsunami may have benefited some of these properties along the North Shore. You can see the piles of sand right here, almost forming what appears to be almost like a dune. And what I think happened, and maybe contributing to why the beach is in such good condition right now, is that the tsunami wave was actually able to dredge up some of the deeper sands offshore that normal waves wouldn't be able to carry with it and pushed it back up onto the beach. And a lot of that sand overwashed into the private developments, into the yards, and then we pushed that sand back up onto the beach, and that's the piles of sand you see here. And so I think it actually had a secondary positive impact. Outside of the flooding and the damage, it did some good for some of these beaches.
That's really interesting. And that's one of those pieces when you're trying to understand your mitigation efforts that you just can't ever know it's going to happen or what the impact's going to be.
Exactly. The hard thing about beaches is that they're ever changing, and as much as we observe them, we never entirely understand them. So sometimes it's just unpredictable.
That's probably also a little bit why people love them so much. They're dynamic.
Exactly. When I talk to school groups, that's usually the word I use. Maui's dynamic beaches, because they're dynamic because they're so beautiful and they draw us all in, but they're dynamic also because they're always changing.
How did you get interested in studying beaches?
Well, when I was a kid, I grew up in the middle of the country, southeast Tennessee, in the mountains. And I would get to go occasionally, maybe every few years, to the East Coast, usually in South Carolina, when my parents would take us there on vacation. And they said they knew from the time I was 5 years old that I was drawn to the beach and that somehow that would be connected to my future. And it turns out I never lost interest, and I ended up being lucky enough to go to a college in South Carolina, near where I grew up going on vacation. And it was one of the only undergraduate institutions, is one of the only undergraduate colleges that has a marine science program. And my parents were very supportive in getting me set up there, and off I went. And I learned about geology there. You know, I knew sort of about marine science, but I didn't know there were so many different aspects, and I certainly didn't know that you could build a whole career on studying beaches. And getting paid to go to the beach. So I'm very lucky in that way. And then once I finished up at Coastal Carolina University, I started thinking about graduate school, and I looked at coming out to the University of Hawaii on kind of a whim, and it was just a perfect fit. Chip Fletcher, who's a professor and was my advisor at UH, needed somebody who had already studied beaches and knew a little bit about monitoring shoreline change and doing beach profiles, and he had a program that needed some research support, and I had done a little bit of that as an undergraduate. And we connected, and I was so lucky to be able to come to University of Hawaii and study coastal geology.
And now you provide the same service for Maui County and Maui College?
Yeah, I have a really unique niche here on Maui. I'm employed by the University of Hawaii, but I'm stationed over here on Maui, and I'm co-located with the planning department. And there's a whole program within the planning department that's supposed to regulate the shoreline. There's a federal coastal zone management program. It's a federal program that was established, I think, in the 70s to regulate shoreline development, to protect our beaches and the beach environment. And that program has been implemented at the state level. And in Hawaii, one of the very unique things about Hawaii is that's further implemented by the counties. So some of the regulatory authority is given to the counties. And in Maui County, that's implemented through the planning department. But the planners are planners. They're urban planners. They don't necessarily have expertise in beaches and shoreline processes. So there's a great partnership there. Maui County supports the University of Hawaii Sea Grant, and University of Hawaii Sea Grant supports Maui County with technical knowledge. So I will advise the planners if there's a permit application related to some type of shoreline development, or many times I'm involved in the pre-permitting stages when a homeowner will call up and say, hey, I'm having erosion problem. What can I do? And I'm able to go out on site and consult with them, talk about beach processes, talk about their possible solutions. Another aspect of my job is education. So I get to do fun things like go to schools and talk to school groups about beaches and shorelines and Maui's dynamic beaches. And we get to talk to people like yourself and hopefully, changes are generational. We really have a great coastal zone management program in here in Hawaii. It's one of the most progressive in the country, even though we still face a lot of challenges and it's frustrating sometimes. And it takes a generation to really, at least a generation, to educate people and have everybody come to some shared understanding of what it takes to protect the shoreline and the environment.
I think what you're doing in science and working with the planning department is so powerful. We don't often see that, where research is being conducted simultaneously in the same office where people are making management decisions, and how wonderful that is that you can use what you're learning to better help our land, our Aina, and the people at the same time.
Right, you're right. There has to be a bridge. Otherwise, those pieces get disconnected, the research and the implementation and the regulation. So there definitely needs to be a bridge. And I'm lucky to be able to fill that niche.
Yeah, we're lucky to have you. So when you guys put the wooden poles in, was this not here yet? Is this all new?
More than likely, there were a few small pahoehoe plants strategically placed back there behind the post and rail, and they spread. They spread very quickly, and you can see pretty extensively. And then as the sand begins to build up underneath it, they just rise to the top and continue to colonize. And they'll continue to grow seaward until they have some interaction with waves.
They're just beautiful.
So you can tell pahoehoe from, of course, from these leaves, but also the purple flowers that bloom within. And then a lot of times we colonize that and intersperse it with the aki grass. And I am going to walk into the dunes.
I feel like I'm doing something illegal.
You shouldn't do this on a regular basis, but we can carefully walk through the dunes. And this is aki grass, also another native species. And you'll see it.
Really pretty close up.
It's pretty common, and this aki here is it's still catching on. It's not very thick yet, but it'll spread.
And why do you intersperse it? And why is it helpful to have both the morning glory and the grass together?
Well, they each have their own tolerances, and so sometimes, sometimes one will end up doing better than another. Sometimes we don't even know why. So a lot of times we'll try to plant both species and just hope that they both take off, and sometimes only one ends up doing well and the other one may not. It's beautiful too. It makes it look more like its natural environment, like it would have back before man disturbed the dune systems, and there were lots of all of these types of plants.
So when you talk about dune restoration, what does that physically look like? How do you...
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. We're really lucky here on Maui. We have a group of volunteers, the South Maui volunteers, or Ho'alaha Aina is what they call themselves, and they have basically learned from my predecessors here on the island, from Sea Grant and UH, about how to do dune restoration, how you effectively do it, and they've been doing it for so long now, working with Sea Grant and working with the county parks, that they've almost got a self-perpetuating program. And what they'll do now that they've already kind of started the restoration project here, it's more of a maintenance issue. So they'll come in on a relatively regular basis and just make sure that the access pathways are open, that people aren't creating new access pathways in undesirable locations. They'll trim back the Naupaka if need be, or remove other invasive species. Make sure that if there's a need for posts and rope to kind of keep people out of the active dune system, that it's there. But if you're talking about starting from scratch with a brand new dune restoration, you follow nature's cues. You find out, you'll start to see where sand begins, wind-blown sand, it blows down the beach and it starts to mound up. And you can take advantage of that. So you may start out with some sand fencing, like what you see right here.
Oh, I see.
Sand fencing. And it's placed strategically to collect sand as it blows down the beach. And once it starts trapping sand, then you have the beginnings of your dune, and then you can start colonizing it with the appropriate species.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So when you see that fencing on a beach, that's what they're doing. They're trying to get sand to accrete or mound up.
That's exactly right. It actually serves a couple of functions, that being the primary function. The other thing we've learned that it does really well is designate pathways. So in this case, you'll see right behind that sand fence is a pathway for people to move up and from the beach down to the up to the park.
So I'm really interested in this issue of resiliency. So the dune species, they're living in this environment where they're affected by the wind and the salt and the waves, but they're able to live through that. But what they can't withstand is people walking through them. And why is that?
Well, a little bit of walking is okay. They can be resilient to that too. But in a lot of our beach parks, we're talking about hundreds and thousands of people per day. And they just can't be trampled like that and manage to survive. But you're right. They are naturally tolerant of the natural conditions that they're exposed to. Not humans, but nature. Salt spray, even being inundated with salt water, they can survive that.
That makes sense.
And not very many species can.
No, they're amazing, amazing.
When you have high waves, the water can reach all the way up to the base of these dunes, and then the sand becomes mobilized in the beach system. And in a big storm, the sand will move offshore into the water as the water carries it back offshore. And when it does that, the water becomes shallower. The sand fills in the pukas in the reef, or maybe forms little sandbars offshore. The water becomes shallower, the waves break farther offshore, and that reduces the energy at the shoreline. And so it helps to prevent loss of the beach.
I see. And what happens to the Naupaka then?
Well, the Naupaka, in a large storm, it can be sacrificial. And it will regrow eventually. Interesting thing about Naupaka, maybe we should move on down to the dunes.
Okay. I've always actually been curious about that because, I hear that the Naupaka protects the dunes and it allows the sand to accrete, but then what happens to the Naupaka? And as you said, it's just sacrificial.
It's sacrificial. It can be replanted or it may regrow on its own. But the interesting thing about Naupaka is you see a ton of Naupaka along, at least on Maui, along the beaches. And a lot of times it's actually planted. And here's the Naupaka we're talking about. It isn't always the best dune colonizer.
Oh, really?
It's a good one, but, and this is a good example of what Naupaka should look like on a dune system. It's not really dense, it's not expansive, but there are a lot of places where the Naupaka is used for landscaping and it's irrigated. And when it's irrigated, it becomes very, very thick and very, very dense. And that actually works against the beach because it doesn't allow the sand to naturally build up into the mounds that ultimately form sand dunes. It almost behaves something like a seawall,
Right.
which impounds the sand and doesn't allow it to, the dune to develop. So Naupaka is good, but it has to be used the right way, at least in terms of doing restoration on dunes.
That's so interesting. I think it actually gets at my question because when I see it like this, I can see how the sand could move and fill up the area and then move back out. But when it is really dense, like you're saying, the dirt just gets trapped and the sand can't move back and forth.
That's exactly right.
That's really cool.
So you can see the posts and ropes here along this dune line. And the reason this post and rope here is because we have some active dune restoration going on. So these dunes here in the parks had gotten pretty degraded, and about maybe 5 or more years ago we started a pretty extensive dune restoration program here, and so we've actually thinned out a lot of the Naupaka.
Oh, wow.
And we've planted some other species like beach morning glory, which you see the vines up there behind Mauka of the Naupaka is beach morning glory or pahuihui. And it's a very, very good dune colonizer because it grows really rapidly and it spreads out pretty extensively, and but it doesn't get too dense and it doesn't impound the sand like Naupaka can.
And that's what's over there too?
Yeah, you'll see all those vines are pahuihui, and then you'll see little sprigs of grass in between sticking up. Those are aki grass. That's another very good dune colonizer. So those are really kind of the 3 primary ones we use in our restoration projects: Naupaka, pahuihui, and aki.
Turn your love of the ocean into a lifelong career. Join NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as we unlock the secrets in the deep oceans, track rapidly moving storms, model climate trends, protect and preserve our marine resources, and so much more. It's all in a day's work at NOAA. Find a career that makes a world of difference, enriching life through science, service, and stewardship. NOAA.
The Curriculum Research and Development Group in the College of Education at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. CRDG has been providing quality educational programs and services for over 40 years, serving students, teachers, parents, educators, and experts around the world and here in Hawaii. The Curriculum Research and Development Group, improving schools, improving education. CRDG.
The University of Hawaii's Sea Grant College Program, focused on Hawaii's coasts and its communities through sustainable development, safe seafood supply, sustainable coastal tourism, hazard resilience, and healthy coastal ecosystems. Hawaii's Sea Grant.
Exploring Our Fluid Earth is a dynamic curriculum developed by the University of Hawaii's Curriculum Research and Development Group, teaching ocean science concepts through the disciplines of physics, chemistry, biology, and ecology. Exploring Our Fluid Earth is now available freely online. Find out more at exploringourfluidearth.org.